So today we're talking about taxing and spending, the two things the government does with money. Now, when we talk about what the government should and shouldn't do, that conversation is usually a reflection of simply what the government should and shouldn't do to spend money and what it should and shouldn't do to raise money, because this is most often how people interact with government, is paying taxes and receiving services that the government is providing by spending. So the first term we need to go over is the deficit. This is a term you've probably heard in conversations about politics before. The deficit is simply the difference between, in a year, the amount of money the government spends and the amount of money it brings in. Just like you or I have a personal budget where, for example, I get paid a salary each month. And so in general, I try to spend less money in the month than I have made. If I spend more money than I get in the month, then I'm going to run a deficit as well, right? I'll go into debt because I'll have spent more money than I had. The government is kind of the same way in this regard. So the government, if it spends more than it makes in a year, that is the deficit for that year. Now, each year, if the government spends more than it makes, which it does, there's that deficit. That deficit gets added to all the other deficits from all the previous years, and that makes up the national debt. So each year, it's like, oh, we've added this much more debt, we owe this much more money, add that to all the money we already owe, and that makes up the national debt. So each year has a deficit. All the deficits added together make up the national debt. So the deficit tends to be larger during certain periods and tends to be smaller during certain periods, but almost always exists. The only time there has not been a deficit in the past 50 to 60 years were 4 years when Bill Clinton was president, when they managed to have a surplus. Now remember, that just means that they didn't add anything to the national debt those years, but all the debt from previous still was there. The times that the debt tends to be higher tends to be when there is a Republican president in general. If you look at this graph over time, you see 1980, a rise in deficits during the Reagan years, a slight reduction during the Carter years, an increase during Bush first years. Bill Clinton's years, they tended to actually go into surplus. And then you like Bush number 2, greater deficit. And then with the economic recession of 2008, a massive deficit because of the big stimulus bill that Obama passed when he first entered office. Those tended to get smaller until Donald Trump took office and they started to get larger. That is because Republicans tend to cut taxes in general, but don't cut spending, right? So they bring in less money, but they spend the same amount. In fact, sometimes they spend more because they increase spending on the military. This is not always true, but it is in general true. If you look at just the last 10 years, you'll see kind of more of a close-up of what the deficit has looked like. Again, with the economic recessions, the deficit is bigger. It tended to shrink over Obama's years. And then when Trump became president, he had his big tax cut bill that increased the deficit because they didn't cut spending, but they cut the amount of taxes they were bringing in. In this projected column, it should be noted that the deficit went way lower just past this line here in 2020 because there was another stimulus even bigger than the one Obama passed. So if this projected was correct, which is not because they didn't know about the COVID pandemic coming along, it would be much, much longer. So the national debt has been growing consistently pretty much forever. And you'll often hear people be really alarmed about this. We have to do something about the debt. The debt is out of control, XYZ. Those tend to be excuses to complain about government programs. So saying we can't have universal health care, we can't have expansion of welfare because it will cost too much and there's already too much debt. But that usually is only said politically to gain advantage in an argument. Whereas when it comes to advocating for certain things like expansions of the military, then nobody says, what about the debt? The other thing we have to consider, like we said before, is that government debt is different than debt for you or I. If I have, for example, student loans, I have to pay them and I have to come up with the money to pay them, whereas the federal government prints the money. So their debt is a little bit different. And that's what we're going to explore in the next video.